Diane Mercer, my 70-year-old mother-in-law, held out her hand across the Thanksgiving table and ordered my 17-year-old daughter, Sophie, to surrender her phone. When Sophie refused, Diane took the engraved Mercer house key beside her plate, dropped it into the ceramic bowl used during the family's Sunday circles, and dragged an old oak chair into the center of the dining room. Conversation died. Diane announced that Sophie would sit there while the adults explained how she had disrespected the family, and she would not get her key back until she wrote an apology. My name is Rachel Mercer. I am 46, and I work in hospital quality and compliance. For years, I had convinced myself that the Mercer's ritual was only their awkward way of handling conflict. I had sat in that chair myself, handed over my phone, listened while relatives listed my failures, and written repair statements, because my husband, Evan Mercer, always said giving his mother what she wanted was easier than letting conflict tear the family apart. I kept believing patience would buy peace, but Sophie was not going to pay for my patience. When Diane told her to sit, I stood, crossed the room, and took Sophie's key from the bowl. Diane warned that walking out would prove I had never respected the family. Evan asked me to stay and finish this properly. I looked at my husband, then at my daughter's pale face, and understood that staying would teach Sophie the lesson Diane wanted. Belonging could be revoked whenever she refused obedience. I took Sophie home. Hours later, Evan returned alone. He left a folder from the Mercer family property office on our kitchen counter and went upstairs. I only meant to move it. Then a familiar sheet of handwriting slipped loose. It was a photocopy of a repair statement I had written almost 3 years earlier. Diane had promised me she destroyed it. For several seconds, I stared at the photocopy on our kitchen counter. I knew the page before I finished the first line. The slant of the capital R was mine. So was the faint brown crescent near the bottom, left by the coffee cup I had knocked over during a Sunday circle almost 3 years earlier. That night, after I wrote what Diane called a repair statement, my mother-in-law had folded the sheet once, looked directly at me, and said she was destroying it because reconciliation meant starting clean. Now the same words were clipped inside a folder from the Mercer family property office. I did not wake Evan. I did not start searching through papers that were not mine. I pulled out only the photocopy bearing my name and read the page beneath it. The heading concerned our rental house, which Diane owned through one of the family companies. I reached a line referring to a behavior history connected to our household, followed by a note about reviewing our month-to-month housing arrangement if the conflict remained unresolved. I slid both pages back, exactly where I had found them, and opened the small notebook I used for work. At the hospital, I spent my days separating assumptions from facts. In my own kitchen, I had spent years doing the opposite whenever the Mercers were involved. The next morning, I asked Evan whether Diane had kept my old repair statements. My husband stood at the coffee maker with his back to me. He went still for just long enough that I noticed. Then he said his mother kept family paperwork and that it probably meant nothing. I reminded him that she had promised to destroy that statement. Evan rubbed both hands over his face and said he did not remember exactly what she had said 3 years ago. When I mentioned behavior history, his expression turned guarded. He said the property office sometimes made notes when there was conflict involving a tenant, even family. I asked why a private apology written in Diane's dining room had anything to do with our housing. He had no answer except the one I had heard for years. If I would attend the next circle and settle things, none of this would matter. That was when I understood my first mistake. I had treated each Sunday circle as a separate ugly evening. Diane had apparently kept a record. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I went to Diane's house alone because I still wanted to believe there was a smaller solution than tearing apart my marriage. Diane opened the door before I reached the porch and greeted me as if nothing unusual had happened. The brass key bowl sat on the narrow table near the dining room entrance. Sophie's engraved key was inside it. Diane Mercer never needed to raise her voice to make a room feel smaller. I told her plainly that I was willing to move past Thanksgiving if Sophie was never required to participate in another Sunday circle. My daughter would not surrender her phone. She would not sit in the oak chair while adults accused her. She would not write a statement to earn back a key. Diane asked whether I understood what I was teaching Sophie by removing her from consequences. I told her this was not about avoiding consequences. It was about refusing humiliation. Diane said Sophie had embarrassed her in front of the family, and that I had made it worse by walking out. She picked up Sophie's key, turned it between two fingers, and said it would be returned when Sophie understood that family membership came with responsibilities. I asked for the key. Diane closed her hand around it. That tiny movement affected me more than if she had shouted. The key did not actually control our front door. It was ceremonial, engraved with Mercer and given to Sophie after Evan and I married. But Diane was holding it like a license she had issued and could revoke. I told her Sophie did not need it if that was the condition attached to it. For the first time, Diane's smile disappeared. She said I had always confused boundaries with rejection. Then she reminded me that during one of my earlier circles, I had admitted I sometimes wanted to take Sophie and disappear from all of this. The sentence hit me hard enough that I forgot to answer. I remembered saying it. I remembered the chair beneath me, and Evan sitting somewhere to my left. But I also remembered that sentence because I had never written it in any repair statement. I had said it after nearly an hour of questions, when I was exhausted and angry. Diane continued talking, but I stopped hearing whole sentences. When she finally handed me my coat, she still had Sophie's key. On the drive home, I repeated the quote aloud so I would not distort it later. I pulled into a parking lot and wrote it in my notebook. Then I added a second fact. That sentence was spoken, not written. I found my old copy of the repair statement that evening. Years earlier, before handing the original to Diane, I had photographed it because something about signing a statement after a family argument had felt wrong even then. The words Diane quoted were not there. I read the page twice. Evan sat across from me at the dining table while I showed him the image and explained what had happened at his mother's house. He said Diane had a remarkable memory. I asked whether he truly believed she could remember one sentence from a 3-year-old argument word for word. Evan looked toward the hallway instead of at me. She remembers conflict, he said. Before I could push harder, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sophie came into the kitchen carrying a bowl of cereal. I stopped because I was not willing to turn her into evidence in an argument between adults. She sat beside me anyway and asked whether Grandma Diane had returned her key. When I said no, Sophie gave a short, humorless laugh. Then she asked something that changed the shape of my suspicion. Did she move the little black thing? I asked what she meant. Sophie said that on Thanksgiving, just before Diane dragged the oak chair into the room, she had seen her grandmother bend beside the dining room sideboard and reach underneath it. Sophie had assumed Diane was adjusting a speaker or plugging something in. She described a small, dark object tucked near the underside of the cabinet. I asked whether she had actually seen what it was. Sophie said no. I made myself write exactly that. She had seen Diane reach beneath the sideboard. She had seen a dark object. She had not identified it. I did not tell Sophie what I feared. The next morning, Evan left early for the Mercer family office. He came home after dinner carrying another folder and told me Diane had asked him to review a draft memorandum concerning our housing. She wanted, in his words, to formalize expectations if the family conflict continued. I asked whether I could read it. Evan hesitated, then slid it toward me. The memorandum was only a draft, but its language made my hands cold. It referred to our month-to-month arrangement, the possibility of terminating it, and an unresolved domestic instability issue. I asked who had written that phrase. Evan said he did not know. The family property office was small, and Diane reviewed nearly everything involving relatives. Halfway down the second page, I found handwriting in the margin. Sophie transition options. What does that mean? Evan came around the table and looked down. He said he had never seen the note before. I asked whether Diane was suggesting Sophie should live somewhere else. He said I was jumping to conclusions. I pointed out that the document concerned our home and that the note named my daughter. Evan's face reddened. He said his mother was angry, not plotting to take Sophie from me, and that I was making every ugly possibility sound certain. He was right about one thing. I could not prove what the note meant. So I said exactly that. I do not know what it means. I know it is there. The distinction mattered to me now. Evan pushed the folder away and told me we could make the entire problem disappear by attending the scheduled circle. Just one evening. Just an apology for how Thanksgiving had ended. Just enough to let Diane save face. I looked at the draft housing memorandum, then at the photograph of my old repair statement, then at the notebook where I had written Sophie's observation about the sideboard. For years, just one evening, had been the sentence that brought me back to Diane's chair. Now, our home was being discussed in the same paperwork as my behavior, and my daughter's name was written in the margin. I closed my notebook. I was done asking how to make Diane less angry. I needed to find out what she had been keeping, what she could actually use against me, and how to get Sophie out from under her control before the next Sunday circle gave Diane anything else to keep. The next morning, I opened my work notebook before anyone else was awake and drew a line down the center of a clean page. On the left, I wrote what I knew. Diane had kept a repair statement she had promised to destroy. She had quoted a sentence I remembered saying, but had never written. Sophie had seen Diane reach beneath the dining room sideboard before the Thanksgiving confrontation. A housing memorandum linked our conflict to our month-to-month rental and contained the words, Sophie transition options. On the right, I wrote what I did not know. I did not know whether any circle had been recorded. I did not know what Diane intended by that note about Sophie. I did not know what Evan had known before I found the photocopy. Writing those distinctions calmed me more than reassurance had. When Evan came downstairs, I asked him 3 questions. Had Diane ever kept repair statements after telling people they were gone? Had anything said inside a Sunday circle ever been stored in the family office? Had anyone before me objected strongly enough to stop participating? Evan stood beside the kitchen island with his coffee cooling in his hand. He said repair statements sometimes ended up in what Diane called family files, but he had always assumed they were records of resolved disputes. He said he had never personally seen a recording from a circle. Then he admitted there had been one person who fought the whole system years before. That was the first time Evan brought up Mark Hayes in a way that mattered. Mark was the former husband of Evan's younger sister, Nora Mercer Hayes, who handled billing for the family company. I knew Mark mostly through the Mercer version. He became angry, accused everyone of controlling him, and eventually walked out on Nora and their children. Evan told me Mark had once refused a circle and later claimed the family twisted his words. Everyone had taken that as another sign that Mark was unstable. Did you ever ask him what he meant? Evan looked down at his mug. At the time, no. The answer hurt because I recognized the pattern. Someone objected. The family gave the objection a diagnosis. After that, nobody had to examine it again. I wrote down only what Evan had actually told me. Later that afternoon, Diane appeared at our front door carrying 2 Thanksgiving serving dishes I had forgotten. Sophie was upstairs doing homework, and Evan was still at work. Diane set the dishes on the counter and said there was still a quiet solution. If I attended the Sunday circle alone and accepted responsibility for encouraging Sophie's disrespect, she would consider leaving my daughter out of it. I asked why I needed to surrender my phone and sit in a particular chair for a private family conversation. Diane said the rules prevented interruptions and made everyone listen equally. I asked why written repair statements had been kept after forgiveness. She said keeping a record was not the same as using it against someone. Then I asked about the sentence she had quoted to me, the one that did not appear in my statement. Her face barely changed. Have you ever recorded a Sunday circle? No, Diane said. Of course not. Recording something like that would violate the family's trust. There was no hesitation. I did not mention Sophie's observation about the sideboard. I asked if she was certain. Diane said yes, then reminded me that our housing arrangement existed because the Mercer family had tried to give Evan and me stability. She said she hoped I would choose peace before Sunday. After I closed the door, I stood with my hand on the lock. For years, Diane's certainty had made me doubt myself. This time it gave me something I could test. I called Nora. Nora, Evan's younger sister, had always been cordial with me but careful around conflict. She worked inside the same family company Diane controlled, and I had watched her change subjects whenever her mother's temper entered a conversation. I told her I was not asking her to take sides. I asked one narrow question. Had she ever seen a recording device near the dining room sideboard during a Sunday circle? The silence lasted so long I checked whether the call had dropped. Finally, Nora said, "Rachel, do not do this." She said she needed her job. Her health insurance came through the company, and her younger son's college bills were already difficult. She did not want her name pulled into anything involving Diane. Her fear was so specific that I stopped pressing. I apologized and told her I would not ask again. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Nora had sent a photograph. It was an old birthday picture taken in Diane's dining room. Nora and one of her sons stood in front holding a cake. Behind them was the sideboard. I enlarged the image until the faces blurred. Tucked beneath the wooden lip of the cabinet was a small black digital recorder. I sat down. The photograph did not prove every circle had been recorded. It did not prove mine had been recorded. It did prove that Diane's absolute statement at my front door was false. Another message arrived from Nora. Do not send that picture back to me. Mark kept records because nobody believed him. Then she stopped answering. I wanted to call and ask what records, what Mark had kept, what nobody had believed. I did not. Nora had given me more than she intended, and I could see the price she feared paying. I saved the photograph in 2 places and wrote down exactly how I had received it, including Nora's warning. That evening, I showed Evan the photograph, nothing else. I did not tell him what I thought about Mark. I did not tell him Nora had warned me not to involve her. I enlarged the image and pointed to the recorder. Evan stared at it. Where did you get this? From someone who was there. Who? I am not giving you that name. His chair scraped backward. He said I was turning his family into an investigation. I reminded him that his mother had denied any circle was ever recorded, and I now have a photograph of a recorder hidden beside the chair. Evan said it could have been there for something else, a birthday message, work, music, anything. I said that was possible, but it did not explain Diane's absolute denial. He asked me to delete the photograph. I stared at him. Delete the evidence that your mother lied to me. It is not evidence of what you think it is. I just told you I do not know exactly what it proves. Evan pressed both palms against the table. You are documenting conversations. You are calling people. You are building a case. I looked at the notebook beside my hand. Because every time I ask a question, someone tells me I am imagining the reason I asked it. I wanted him to look at the photograph again. I wanted him to be angry, or frightened, or simply curious. Instead, he looked exhausted. He said he could not spend another night being cross-examined in his own kitchen. I told him I was his wife, not an opposing attorney. He went upstairs. I heard drawers opening, a closet door, then the zipper of a bag. When Evan came back down, he had packed enough clothes for several days. He said he was going to stay at Diane's house until everyone calmed down. I asked whether he understood what it meant to leave me, and Sophie alone in a house his mother had just threatened to take back. He said he was not abandoning us. He was trying to stop things from getting worse. Who gets calmer when you go to her house? Evan did not answer. He left. Sophie came halfway down the stairs after the front door closed. She had heard enough to know where he had gone. I told her the only thing I could promise honestly. None of this was her responsibility. Then I locked the door and sat at the kitchen table. The photograph was still open on my phone. The next morning, an envelope was taped to our front door. Inside was written notice that the month-to-month housing arrangement would be terminated. The language was formal, but underneath it, I heard the same message Diane had delivered for years. Return to the circle, accept the family's version, or lose something that mattered. I called Evan. He did not answer. A few minutes later, I opened the Mercer family group chat to see whether anyone had mentioned the notice. Instead of the thread, I found a system notice saying Diane had removed me. Beneath it, the remaining member list still included Evan. I read the notice twice. I had been removed. My husband had not. I sat alone in the house Diane owned, holding a termination notice issued after I refused her ritual, with my husband sleeping under her roof and the rest of his family behind a digital door that had just closed in my face. For the first time, the isolation was not something I could explain away as hurt feelings. It had structure. It had structure, and once I admitted that, I could no longer treat the Mercer family's behavior as a series of bad moods. I spent the morning after the housing notice at my kitchen table, with my work notebook open, the termination letter on my left, Nora's photograph on my right, and the old repair statement in front of me. I kept returning to the same name Evan had mentioned, Mark Hayes, Nora's former husband, the man the Mercers had described for years as angry, unstable, and unwilling to take responsibility. Nora had told me only that Mark kept records because nobody believed him. That was not enough for me to decide he had been right. It was enough to look for something outside the family. Using the county court website, I searched Mark's full name, then narrowed the results by Nora's name and the approximate years of their divorce. Most of what appeared was ordinary procedural language I barely understood. Then I found an older case in which Diane Mercer's name appeared alongside Mark's. The online docket showed a hearing, an audio exhibit, and a later entry referring to disputed context. I read the lines several times because I did not want my fear to turn vague wording into proof. The actual exhibit was not available online. Neither was the full transcript. I requested certified copies. The fee was small. The decision was not. Ordering those records meant opening a door into another marriage and a history the Mercers treated as settled. I thought about Nora's warning and the children who had already lived through it. Then I looked at the termination notice. Diane had moved from demanding an apology to threatening the roof over Sophie's head. I completed the request. While I waited for the records, I did something harder than searching a courthouse database. I examined my own history. I pulled old calendars from a storage box, searched my phone for messages with dates I remembered, and compared them with the photographs I had saved of 2 repair statements. I did not write down conclusions. I wrote sequences. A disagreement would happen. Diane would say the problem had become too serious for ordinary conversation. A Sunday circle would be scheduled. Phones would be left in the kitchen. Whoever had been accused would sit in the oak chair while the others spoke. The accused person would answer questions until resistance started sounding, even to herself, like stubbornness. Then came the handwritten statement. After that came relief, a hug, food. Someone saying the family was whole again. Then, months later, a sentence from that night would return. I found a message I had sent Evan after one circle 2 years earlier. I cannot believe your mother brought up what I said last spring again. At the time, I had been annoyed, not alarmed. Another calendar entry said dinner at Diane's. Do not argue. I had written it as though the problem was my ability to endure the evening correctly. The worst part was remembering how often I had defended the ritual to Sophie. When she was younger, I told her every family had its own way of working things out. I had turned my discomfort into a lesson about tolerance because the alternative would have required me to act. That afternoon, my phone rang. The name on the screen was Michael Cole. Michael was Sophie's father and my former husband. Our marriage had ended years earlier, but we had worked hard to build a steady co-parenting relationship, and we usually spoke only about Sophie's schedule, school, or practical matters. His voice was careful when I answered. He asked whether something was happening between me and Evan's family. I asked why. Michael said a woman connected to the Mercers had contacted him and asked whether Sophie could stay with him for stability if our housing situation became complicated. My stomach tightened. I asked if the woman had identified herself. Michael said Diane had. He had not agreed to anything, and he had not discussed changing Sophie's living arrangement. He was calling because the request felt wrong, especially because Sophie had not mentioned wanting to leave my home. I asked exactly what Diane had said. Michael repeated only what he remembered and promised to forward anything written. I did not give him my theories. I told him only that Diane and I were in a serious dispute. Our housing had been threatened, and I was trying to learn what information she had collected about me. After the call, I sat very still. The handwritten note on the housing memorandum had said Sophie transition options. I still did not know what Diane intended when she wrote or approved those words. Now I knew she had contacted Sophie's father about where Sophie might live. That was no longer my imagination. The certified court packet arrived several days later in a thick envelope. I waited until Sophie was at school before opening it. I read the docket first, then the hearing transcript, forcing myself not to skip ahead whenever I saw Diane's name. The case had involved a request for a protective order during the collapse of Nora and Mark's marriage. I did not know everything that happened between them, and I reminded myself of that repeatedly. The record contained allegations from both sides that I had no way to verify. But one section was painfully clear. Diane had provided an audio excerpt that she said demonstrated Mark making a threat during a family confrontation. Mark's attorney challenged the recording because the excerpt began after questions had already been asked and ended before Mark clarified what he meant. The hearing transcript reflected concern about missing surrounding context. The court did not treat the shortened excerpt the way Diane had urged it to be treated. I read that section again, then again. I was not reading a family story. I was reading a certified record created years before my own fight with Diane. A recording connected to a family confrontation had been presented outside the family, and the missing context had mattered. My hands began to shake. For years, when Mark's name came up, the Mercers said he had threatened people and then claimed everyone misunderstood him. They said the family had tried to help Nora and the children while Mark rewrote history. I had believed them because I had no reason not to. Now I had a source showing that at least one piece of the story was more complicated than they had ever admitted to me. The transcript did not prove Diane had recorded me. It did not prove the black device in Nora's photograph had captured a Sunday circle. It did not prove every claim Mark had ever made. But it destroyed one comforting explanation I had been clinging to, that even if Diane kept records, she kept them only inside the family. Near the end of the packet, I found contact information associated with Mark from the time of the case. The number was old. The address was older. I copied both into my notebook anyway. I spent the rest of that day deciding whether to contact him. Mark had not volunteered to become part of my problem, and hearing from Evan's wife could feel like another intrusion. If I reached out, I would tell him how I found him and let him decide whether to respond. The old number was disconnected. Using public information tied to the court record, I found a current business listing with the same full name. I sent one short message through the company's public contact address. I identified myself as Evan Mercer's wife, cited the public case number, and said I had found a reference to an audio exhibit while researching a current dispute involving Diane. I told him he owed me nothing. He replied the next day. Mark's first response was only 3 sentences. He asked how I obtained the case number, whether Nora had sent me, and whether Diane knew I was contacting him. I answered each question directly. I had found the case through public records, after Nora mentioned only that he had kept records. Nora had not sent me. As far as I knew, Diane did not know. Mark agreed to a phone call. He sounded guarded. Mark said he was not interested in helping me punish the Mercers or reopening his divorce. I told him I was not asking him to. Then I asked whether he had ever been required to participate in a Sunday circle. There was a pause. Mark said yes. He told me what he personally remembered: being told to leave his phone in another room, being questioned by several people at once, and discovering later that part of the confrontation had been recorded. He said the excerpt used during the court dispute did not include the full lead-up to the statement Diane characterized as threatening. I did not ask him what Diane had intended. I asked whether he still had the original. He did. Mark said he had kept the full recording because by then he had learned that arguing about memory was useless. He also kept emails and letters connected to the dispute. He warned me that his experience did not automatically prove mine. The caution made me trust him more than certainty would have. He sent me a digital copy of the full recording and several pieces of correspondence. I listened with headphones at my kitchen table, the certified transcript beside me. Before the line Diane had presented as a threat, several relatives questioned Mark about whether he intended to take the children away from the family. After the line, Mark continued speaking and narrowed what he meant. The full recording did not make every part of his behavior admirable. It did make the shortened version far less complete than the Mercers had implied. I stopped the audio and covered my face with both hands. The dark truth was not that Mark had been perfect. It was that the family had possessed context and still allowed a simpler version of him to become the story everyone repeated. One of the old emails Mark sent mattered even more. It was from Diane. I read it several times before adding it to my evidence log. In the message, Diane defended keeping written statements because, in her words, the family needed protection from outsiders who later rewrote history. The email did not mention me. It was written years before I entered the dispute now consuming my life. That made it more frightening, not less. I finally understood why Nora had sounded afraid instead of surprised when I asked about a recorder. Mark did not offer to call Evan. He did not offer to confront Diane. He did not tell me what to do. Before we ended the call, he said only that if I intended to use any of his material, I should speak to a lawyer first and preserve the originals. That advice matched the part of me I still trusted. I found an Ohio family law attorney whose practice included custody disputes and high-conflict extended family situations. At our consultation, I brought copies, not a dramatic speech. I separated everything into categories: documents I personally possessed, messages sent directly to me, the photograph Nora sent, public court records, Mark's material, and statements I could not yet prove. I explained that Diane owned the house through a family company, that our month-to-month tenancy had been terminated, that she had contacted Michael, and that I feared private statements were being used to portray me as unstable. The attorney did not tell me I had uncovered a conspiracy. She asked practical questions: who held title to the house, whether the termination notice was valid, whether Diane had any legal role over Sophie, and what had actually been sent to Michael. Some answers I had, others I did not. That distinction was useful. I left with a list of actions that felt almost painfully ordinary. Preserve everything in original form. Do not alter files. Respond properly to the housing notice. Avoid making threats. Do not involve Sophie in gathering evidence. And request that any dispute over parenting come through appropriate legal channels rather than family pressure. The attorney also told me that context, source, authenticity, and chain of possession would matter if any recording or written statement were ever used formally. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something other than fear. I felt direction. The price came with it. Acting formally meant I could no longer pretend this would be fixed by one more Sunday circle. I loved Evan, but love was no longer enough to hand my daughter back into a system I did not understand. When I came home from the consultation, Sophie was at the kitchen counter working on an English assignment. I made dinner. We talked about school. I did not tell her about Mark's divorce or play her the recording. She was my daughter, not my witness. After she went upstairs, my phone lit up with a message from Michael. Diane sent me something. You need to see it. There were attachments. The first was a scanned page from one of my old repair statements. Certain sentences had been highlighted. Another page contained typed quotations attributed to me from family discussions. One was the sentence Diane had repeated in her living room, that sometimes I wanted to take Sophie and disappear from all of this. The surrounding questions were not included. Neither was the exhaustion, the argument, or anything that had come before or after. A short note from Diane to Michael said she was concerned that Sophie might be living in an unstable environment and believed he should understand Rachel's own documented statements. I read the phrase until the words blurred. Then I opened every attachment again and saved the originals exactly as Michael had forwarded them. I asked him to preserve Diane's message in his account and not reply on my behalf. He agreed. Only after that did I let myself feel what had happened. Diane was no longer threatening to use the archive. She was using it. The evidence I had gathered now gave me something she had never expected me to possess. A retained statement she had promised to destroy. A photograph contradicting her denial about recording equipment. A certified court record showing an earlier dispute over missing audio context. And Mark's full recording and correspondence, independently of a family context, could change the meaning of a family confrontation. But Diane still had our house in her hands, Evan under her roof, and a file of my own words she had begun sending outside the family. For the first time, I had enough truth to fight back, and for the first time, I knew exactly what she might try to take from me if I did. For the first time, I had enough truth to fight back. And for the first time, I knew exactly what she might try to take from me if I did. I did not call Diane that night. I forwarded the packet Michael had sent me to the attorney I had already consulted and explained where it came from. Then I printed the attachments exactly as I had received them and laid them beside my old repair statement. A sentence I remembered saying after nearly an hour of pressure sat alone in bold type, stripped of the questions that had led to it. Another line from a repair statement had been highlighted as if it were a diagnosis, instead of an apology written because I wanted an argument to end. The next morning, my attorney sent a preservation letter to Diane and the Mercer Family Company. I reviewed it before it went out. It asked them to preserve any original recordings, written statements, digital files, emails, or other materials containing my voice, handwriting, or personal information, and it challenged any effort to use family business records to interfere with my relationship with Sophie. It accused Diane of no crime. It simply made one thing clear. If she had records, she could no longer assume nobody outside her dining room would ask where they came from. By noon, individual messages from Mercer relatives began arriving. One said I had humiliated Diane by involving a lawyer. Another said family problems should stay inside the family. A third asked whether I understood how much stress I was causing Evan. I answered none of them. I saved the messages and went back to work. Evan called after 5. He said Diane had received the letter and the family office was in chaos. When I asked whether he knew she had sent my private words to Michael, he said he had learned afterward. I asked what he had done when he learned. His silence answered me. 2 days later, Evan came home carrying the overnight bag he had taken to Diane's house and a white envelope. Sophie was at the kitchen table with me, working on scholarship deadlines. I told her she could finish upstairs. When we were alone, Evan put the envelope in front of me. My mother wants me to sign this. The document described me as increasingly volatile, unwilling to participate in reasonable family mediation, and prone to making statements about taking Sophie away when I became upset. It said Evan had observed instability in our home and believed temporary separation from Mercer family influence might be necessary for everyone's safety. Did you write this? No? Who did? My mother gave it to me at the office. I asked whether he had seen Diane write it. He had not. He only knew she had placed it in front of him and told him to sign. When I asked what she said would happen if he refused, Evan told me she reminded him that his job existed because the family trusted him. She had not explicitly said she would fire him. I made him separate what she said from what he feared. Then I asked the question that mattered. Are you going to sign it? He did not answer. I understood the cost. Evan's paycheck came from the company his family controlled. His professional contacts were tied to it. Every holiday and every sense of belonging he had known since childhood ran through the same people. What I could no longer accept was pretending there was no choice. I am not asking you to save me, I said. I am asking you not to help her build a record against me. If I refuse, this could destroy my relationship with all of them. If you sign it, it could damage mine with my daughter. His face changed. Neutrality had finally become impossible. The following afternoon, Evan called from the family office. Diane had scheduled an emergency Sunday circle for that evening. According to him, she said the conflict had become too serious to delay, and that everyone needed to decide whether the family would survive what I had started. She wanted me there. She wanted Evan there with the statement. He told me not to come. He said he would handle it. No, I said. I looked at the evidence I had gathered, my retained statement, Nora's photograph, the certified court record, the transcript of Mark's full recording, and the materials Diane had sent Michael. None of it existed because Evan had protected me. I had found it because I stopped waiting for someone else to decide I deserved protection. I am going, I said, but I am not participating in a circle. My attorney knew about the meeting. Copies of my records were preserved elsewhere. Sophie would not come with me. I would keep my phone, refuse the chair, and write nothing. If those terms were unacceptable, I would leave. Before I left, I photographed the contents of my folder in order and placed the originals I did not need in a locked file at home. I wrote down the time I expected to arrive and the names of the people Evan said would be present. The routine felt almost absurdly clinical, but that was the point. Diane's strongest advantage had always been turning emotion into evidence and evidence into family mythology. I would not give her another evening that existed only in competing memories. I also looked once at the unsigned statement she wanted Evan to sign. I imagined how easily one signature could become the sentence repeated at every future holiday. Even her own husband said she was unstable. That possibility frightened me more than the housing notice. A house could be replaced. Sophie's trust, once poisoned by a manufactured story about her mother, would be harder to rebuild. I folded the copy, placed it beneath the court record, and reminded myself that fear was not proof. Evan still had to choose. I arranged for Sophie to stay that evening with Michael, her father. I told her only that I was meeting with Evan's family, and that she was not responsible for the outcome. She asked if Diane was going to make me sit in the chair. No. How do you know? Because I will not. Diane's house looked exactly as it had on Thanksgiving. The porch light was on, the curtains drawn, and cars belonging to relatives filled the driveway. When I walked into the dining room, my 70-year-old mother-in-law had placed the ceramic bowl at the center of the table. The old oak chair stood several feet away from the others, angled toward the family. Evan was near the window. Nora, his younger sister, sat at the far end with her hands folded tightly. 2 adult cousins and an uncle were there too. Diane looked at my purse. Phone stay in the kitchen. No. I set my folder on the table but kept my purse on my shoulder. Diane said the circle could not begin until everyone followed the rules. I told her there would be no circle. If the family wanted to discuss the housing notice, the materials sent to Michael, or the records kept about me, I would discuss those facts. I would not surrender my phone or sit in the chair. She pointed to the brass key bowl. Then, put your key there until we finish. For years, I had obeyed that gesture before understanding why it frightened me. I felt the engraved Mercer key in my pocket and left it there. No. Diane told the room my refusal proved the problem. She said I had become hostile, secretive, and obsessed with finding enemies. She accused me of contacting a bitter former in-law, dragging lawyers into private matters, and exposing Nora to trouble at work. I did not answer each accusation. I opened my folder. The first page I placed on the table was my old repair statement. I explained where it came from and what Diane had promised when I wrote it. The second was Nora's photograph. I did not identify Nora as the source. I said the photograph had been sent to me by someone present at the event and showed a small recorder beneath the dining room sideboard. Diane said nobody could know why the device was there. I agree. The photograph does not prove what it recorded. She looked almost relieved. It does prove that when I asked whether a Sunday circle had ever been recorded, you told me no. and said recording one would violate the family's trust. Diane said she could not remember every device ever placed in her house. I put down the certified court record. I identified the county case and explained that I had obtained it from public records. I did not call Mark innocent or Diane a criminal. I said the transcript showed that an audio excerpt Diane presented years earlier had been challenged because important surrounding context was missing, and the court declined to rely on it as she wanted. One cousin asked what that had to do with me. I placed the transcript of Mark's full recording beside it, because I compared the excerpt discussed in the court record with the complete recording Mark kept. At Mark's name, Nora closed her eyes. Diane told me I had no idea what he had done to the family. I know only what I can document, I said. That is why I am not talking about the rest. Then I put the packet Michael had forwarded to me on top. This was sent to Sophie's father. Evan's uncle leaned forward. By whom? Michael told me Diane sent it. I have the original message he forwarded. Diane said she had been concerned for Sophie's welfare and had every right to speak to a concerned parent. Michael is Sophie's parent, I said. You are not. I showed the highlighted line about wanting to take Sophie and disappear. I explained that I remembered saying it during an old circle after prolonged questioning, that it was not in my handwritten statement, and that the surrounding conversation had not been included in what Michael received. Diane said I was manipulating context because I disliked my own words. Then preserve the full recording. Silence filled the room. Diane looked at Evan and told him this had gone far enough. She said he knew what living with me had been like and had a responsibility to tell his family whether the statement she prepared was true. Evan pulled the folded document from his jacket. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. This was the choice he had postponed through every Sunday circle of our marriage. Diane held out her hand. Sign it. Evan looked at the paper, then at me. I said nothing. After several seconds, he placed the unsigned statement on the dining table. I am not signing that. Diane went still. Evan said he had seen me angry, frightened, and exhausted. He said we had marital problems and he had made them worse by leaving. But he would not say I was unstable or that Sophie needed to be separated from me because he did not believe those things were true. Diane asked whether he understood what he was choosing. I understand what I am refusing to sign. For the first time, the decision was visible to everyone in the room. Diane turned back to me, and her defense changed. She said records were kept because people lied later. Families needed protection. People said terrible things during conflict and then reinvented themselves as victims. Written statements existed so nobody could claim events had happened differently. If recordings had ever been made, she said, they were made for the same reason. Her shift from denial to justification connected everything I had found without requiring me to claim I knew her private intentions. I looked at the bowl, the chair, and the doorway to the kitchen. The phone surrendered in another room prevented the person in the chair from preserving her own context. The chair separated one person from a group. The questions continued until anger, fear, or exhaustion produced sentences worth remembering. The handwritten repair statement turned that exhaustion into something that looked voluntary. Forgiveness brought relief, making the person willing to come back. Later, selected words could be revived as proof that she had always been the problem. I could not know whether Diane had consciously designed every part of the ritual for that purpose. I did not need to know. I could see what it did. I told the room that Sophie and I would never participate in another Sunday circle. Any communication about our housing would be handled in writing. Any claim involving my daughter would go through appropriate legal channels. If private statements attributed to me were distributed, I would answer with their source and context. Diane said I was threatening the family. No, I am leaving your rules. She told Evan that if he walked out with me, he should not assume he would still have a place at the company. She said family businesses depended on trust. She confirmed that our housing termination would proceed. Then she said that if more people needed to see my own words to understand what was happening, she would make sure they did. I heard the threat without needing to name it. Diane pointed to the bowl one last time. If you want to leave this house against your family, put the key down. I reached into my pocket. The brass Mercer key was warm in my hand. Diane had given it to me after Evan and I married, and I had once believed the engraving meant I had been accepted. During every circle, placing it in that bowl had meant agreeing that acceptance could be suspended until I behaved correctly. I closed my fingers around it. No, her voice sharpened. That key belongs to this family, I know. I looked at the chair, the bowl, the sideboard where Sophie had seen Diane reach, and the table now covered with documents that had come from outside Diane's version of events. I am not giving it back because you ordered me to. I will return it when I no longer need anything it opens. I gathered my folder and walked toward the front door. Behind me, Diane told Evan to think carefully before following. A chair scraped. Evan stepped into the hallway. He left with me. That did not repair our marriage. It did not erase the weeks he had minimized what I saw, or the years he had asked me to keep sitting in that chair. It did not give us another home when Diane's deadline expired. Outside, the cold air hit my face. I walked to my car with the Mercer key still in my pocket. The truth was finally visible. So was the price. Diane could no longer make the Sunday circle look harmless, but she still controlled the house we lived in, Evan's job, and a network of relatives accustomed to accepting her records as truth. By refusing her bowl, I had not defeated that power. I had forced her to use it openly. And now there was no way back. There was no way back, so I stopped spending energy looking for one. The morning after the emergency circle, I called the attorney who had helped me answer Diane's housing notice and told her I was no longer trying to preserve access to the Mercer property. I wanted to leave correctly, protect Sophie's school year, and make sure Diane could not turn our departure into another story about instability. The attorney walked me through the dates in the notice and the practical steps for documenting the house. None of it felt dramatic. That was almost a relief. I had spent weeks inside a family system where a chair, a bowl, and a handwritten apology could feel more powerful than ordinary law. Now the important things were written communications, deadlines, and finding somewhere else to live. I began looking for rentals inside Sophie's school area that afternoon. The third place I saw had a kitchen so small I could nearly touch both counters with my arms spread wide, but it was clean, quiet, and close enough that Sophie would not have to transfer during her senior year. The rent would force me to use savings I had intended for emergencies and college expenses. For years, I had told myself the Mercer house gave us security. I had painted walls there, planted hydrangeas beside the porch, and marked Sophie's height inside a closet door because I thought we were building a permanent home. Standing in a stranger's narrow living room with a leasing packet in my hand, I finally understood how conditional that security had always been. The property manager asked whether my husband would be signing too. I do not know yet, I said. That answer hurt, but I did not change it. Evan had left Diane's house with me after the circle, but following me to a parking lot was not the same as choosing a new life. He had spent years asking me to absorb damage so he would not have to confront his family. I could not make my next home depend on whether he became brave quickly enough. When I told Sophie about the apartment, she asked whether she could paint her room eventually. Then she asked if Diane could make us leave that place too. No, I said. It was the first answer I had given her in weeks that did not require a qualification. I signed the lease in my own name. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote it because I knew what it meant. If Evan chose his mother, I would still move. If our marriage ended, Sophie and I would not have to ask Diane Mercer where we were allowed to sleep. I had spent years measuring safety by whether the family was calm. Now I measured it by whether another person could revoke it. I told Evan after the lease was signed. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I had first found the photocopied repair statement. For a moment, he looked wounded that I had acted without him. Then he nodded. I resigned today, he said. Evan explained that he had given notice at the Mercer family company that morning. He said he was contacting people outside the family business and expected we would have to live on my income and savings for a while. You did not have to quit for me. I had to quit for me, he said. I cannot keep calling something a choice if my paycheck depends on making the answer my mother wants. I believed he meant it in that moment. I also knew one good decision did not erase years of easier ones. I told him resigning did not buy his way back into my trust. If he moved with us, Diane would have no unsupervised access to Sophie. There would be no Sunday circles, no private family meetings about me or my daughter, and no sharing information about our home, finances, marriage, or Sophie with Diane. I would remain no contact with her. If Diane needed to communicate about the old house or any legal matter, she could do so in writing or through the appropriate professional channel. Evan asked whether I meant forever. I mean, until I decide something has changed enough for me to reconsider. I am not promising that day will come. He looked down at his hands, then said he wanted to move with us, and understood that staying married would require more than changing his address. Moving day came before the house stopped feeling like ours. I photographed every room before we carried out the last boxes. Sophie stood in her old closet for a long time, looking at the pencil marks where I had recorded her height over the years. I asked if she wanted me to photograph them. She nodded. We left the marks there and took the image with us. The new apartment felt smaller once the boxes arrived. The couch barely fit through the doorway. We ate takeout on the floor the first night because the table was still dismantled. Sophie laughed when Evan discovered he had packed the coffee maker, but not the filters. For a few hours, the ordinary inconvenience of moving felt almost luxurious. No one was grading us. No one was waiting for an apology. A week later, Nora contacted me from a personal email address I had never seen before. Evan's younger sister did not apologize for staying silent, and I was glad she did not try to turn one message into absolution. She wrote that Diane had scheduled another Sunday circle after Evan resigned, this time to discuss what the family should do about the damage I had caused. Nora refused to attend. Several days later, she told me she had begun applying for jobs outside the Mercer company. Because her health insurance and income were tied to the business, she had not walked out immediately. She was making a plan first. I understood that better than I once would have. Evan separately showed me messages from two relatives who had also declined future circles. I did not contact them. I did not recruit anyone against Diane. I had learned too much about family campaigns to start my own. The most surprising update came through both Nora and Evan. Nora forwarded an email she had received at work, and Evan showed me a copy sent to him because it concerned records created while he was still employed. An outside attorney advising the family company instructed employees not to store or distribute personal family recordings, handwritten statements, or similar material through business systems. Existing materials of that kind had to be identified and separated for legal review. There was no declaration that Diane had been defeated, no confession, no family-wide apology. The company still existed. Diane still owned property. Some relatives still believed I had torn the family apart, but the records were no longer invisible. The system had worked because everyone treated Diane's archive as normal and participation in her ritual as the price of belonging. Once people started refusing, she could not force them back into the chair without making the coercion obvious. Part of me hated how unsatisfying that was. I wanted Diane to call and admit she had lied. I wanted her to tell Sophie that Thanksgiving had been wrong. None of that happened. Freedom turned out to be much quieter than vindication. It was changing our mailing address. It was updating Sophie's school records. It was separating bills. It was watching Evan search for jobs without asking his mother which opportunity she approved. It was sitting with a marriage counselor and hearing my husband say, in front of another person, that he had used peacekeeping as an excuse to leave me alone inside conflicts he was afraid to face. I listened, then watched what he did afterward. He stopped asking me to answer Diane's messages because he wanted relief from them. He stopped passing along family gossip unless it directly affected our safety or legal obligations. When Diane attempted to send something about Sophie through him, he returned it. I knew that because he showed me the message and his reply. For the first time, evidence inside my marriage was not something I had to hunt for. My no contact with Diane remained intact. Then, near the beginning of winter break, a padded envelope arrived at the apartment. The return address was the Mercer family office. I photographed the outside before opening it. Inside were no court papers. There was Sophie's engraved Mercer key. A folded card contained a short message from Diane. She said the family remained willing to repair things before the next holiday if we were prepared to reconsider the decisions we had made. Sophie held the key in her palm. I thought she said I had to apologize to get this back. She did. So why did she send it? I do not know. That answer was important. Maybe Diane wanted us to respond. Maybe she wanted the key to remind us what we had lost. Maybe she thought returning it made her look generous. I did not know, and I no longer needed guesses to become certainty. Sophie placed the key on the counter. I do not want it. Neither did I. My own engraved Mercer key was still in the zippered pocket of my purse, where I had put it after the final circle. I took it out and laid it beside Sophie's. Once those keys had meant I had been accepted into Evan's family. Later, I learned they could be taken away during a ritual and returned after obedience. At Diane's house, the key had stopped being a key. It had become a verdict. Following my attorney's guidance, I placed both engraved keys in the return envelope she prepared and included no personal response from me, no accusation, no final speech, no invitation to negotiate. I sealed it. The next afternoon, I bought 2 ordinary replacement keys for our apartment at a hardware store. They had no family name engraved across them, no history, no ceremony. One was for Sophie, one was mine. When I got home, Sophie was deciding where to hang a small wooden key rack she had found in a moving box. Evan held it against the wall near the front door while she told him it was crooked. "A little left," she said. He moved it. Too far. He moved it back. I laughed before I could stop myself. There were still unopened boxes stacked against the living room wall. Our old dining table had a scratch from the move. Evan was still looking for permanent work. I still did not know whether our marriage would survive everything that had happened. Some mornings, I woke angry about how long it had taken me to protect boundaries I could now describe in a single sentence. None of that disappeared because we had left Diane's house. But that evening, nobody could summon me to a chair. Nobody could put Sophie's name in a bowl. Nobody could tell me I had to confess before I was allowed through my own front door. Sophie hung her new key on the wooden hook. After a moment, I hung mine beside it. It was plain metal from a hardware store, worth almost nothing. It opened my home. That was enough.